Okay, so my name is Tanya Shear. I'm the school program manager with Gateway Greening, and this is Gateway Greening's Composting at Home class. So this is going to be more of a panel style. We have 3 panelists that are joining us, and I will introduce them in just a minute and give them a chance to introduce themselves, and then we will be doing a Q&A with them. So if you'll notice on Zoom, you have both a chat and a Q&A function. So we prefer if you have questions for the panelists to put them in the Q&A. It's much easier for me to kind of keep up with them that way. And if you have resources or maybe you want to respond to something someone said, you could feel free to drop that in the chat. But if you do put your questions in the Q&A, it's much easier for me to find those and keep up with those. So please do that. Let's see, what else? I think that's about it with housekeeping. Again, this is recorded and it should be up on YouTube tomorrow at the latest Monday. So if you need to leave early, you can catch the recording later. So just a little bit on composting. I am not myself an expert on composting, but I have done a little bit of it at home. So composting is basically the natural breakdown of organic matter into waste or into a compost. And a compost is used to add to both provide nutrients for plants. It also, let's see, there are lots of benefits. It also adds healthy microbes to the soil. So those are the microorganisms that help to reduce diseases in plants and also help to combat pests in plants. So lots of good reasons to compost. There are large-scale ways of doing it and small-scale at home. So today we're going to focus more on at-home, small-scale composting. And yeah, we'll kind of go from there. There's a lot more we can say on it, but we'll wait to kind of see your questions. So feel free to drop them in as they come through, or as they come to you, and we'll kind of get to those in the last half of this. So I'm going to start by giving each of our panelists just a very brief introduction, and then I'll give each of them as much time as they need to introduce themselves and kind of talk about their experiences with composting. So the first panelist I see in front of me is Katja, and pronounce your last name for me.
Kopp.
Katja Kopp. Okay, easy enough. So Katja is a retired teacher with SLPS, right? And she has quite a bit of experience with composting. She's done a little bit of composting with Vermicomposting, also using a tumbler and a 3-bin compost system. So I think it kind of graduated as they became more experienced. So in her time as a teacher, they managed to compost up to 4,000 pounds in a year from their school cafeteria. Our next panelist is Carlos Soriano. Is that right? Cool. And his experience with gardening and composting goes back about 11 years when he was living in LA. He has also since kind of graduated from a very simple at-home system to something a little more complex. His experience is mainly focused with vermicomposting, and he does a lot of vermicomposting along with making compost tea using a vermicomposter. So I'll let him tell you a little more about himself in a minute. And our third panelist is Ellen Schweiger. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes, very good.
So she is currently a high school science teacher at Hancock High School in St. Louis. And she has been doing vermicomposting for what, 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, 2 years, yeah.
Okay, so fairly new to it, but her experience is more so doing it with youth. So doing it with her students, showing them how easy it is, that something you can do at home, and they've made their own really basic, simple composters. So she'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I will now give each of the panelists as much time as you need to. Just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experiences with composting. So Katja, do you want to begin?
Well, I've been composting for more than 40 years. And probably my first worm composting experience was when Mary Applehof was still alive, and she wrote "Worms Eat My Garbage." And I had already been composting out in the yard, but at that time we were looking at other ways of composting through the winter and stuff. And the person, my partner at the time, got interested. So we had a pretty big worm composting system. And That I've done on and off through the next bunch of years, but I've always found it really easy just to have a compost bin in the backyard and then, you know, just put my compost in it. And I've been doing it for forever. And hopefully somehow other people have learned from it. There's a million ways to do it. It's a natural process. We're mimicking nature when we do it. Nature breaks down all of its organic materials. It's got tons of soldiers doing it and, you know, insects and fungi and so on. And so that's, you know, it's a very easy thing to do. You can't really go too wrong with the backyard composting bin. I think the vermicomposting is a little more complex in trying not to get it messed up with, you know, the wrong foods and so on. But I found that my students, especially my elementary school students, really loved the worm bin. And, you know, they could touch it and play with it. So I'm a big fan of all sorts of composting. And that's my city school. I was a middle school science teacher. So I find science curriculum and composting, they go together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katya. Carlos, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I started with a small rooftop garden back in the day, and a friend of mine that was into gardening mentioned that he had a worm bin. And so I said, okay, let me try that out. And I didn't want to buy one. So I drilled some holes into one of those plastic totes and nested one on top of each other so that there's a little space at the bottom where the leachate can collect. And that's really all you need to get going. That and a handful of worms. These would be the worms. See, it's the stuff that they produce, the worm castings, actually smells really good, like pure soil. And as was mentioned, it's full of, you know, beneficial microorganisms, and those break down. Here's a worm. It's a little baby one. It's on top of my computer, but it's the work computer, so it's okay, right? And then, yeah, you put some, you know, stuff for them to live in, like shredded paper. Usually goes a lot faster than these poorly torn grocery bags. But eventually you get a bit lazy and you don't have a paper shredder anymore. And so that's what you do. And then you feed them anything except for garlic, alliums of any sort. So garlic or onion or citrus or any meat. Otherwise, everything goes. If you wanted to go faster, you have a nice blender that you dedicate in there and you wash your hands just because it's soil, but it still smells really good. So that's not the problem. Everyone wonders if it stinks or collects like vermin. But if you're not throwing anything in there that you really shouldn't be throwing in there, which is pretty much everything except for the things that I mentioned, you should be good to go. And the tea is awesome. It's fantastic because what you do is you take a little cup of worm castings and an air stone, an aquarium pump, and a bucket, and you feed it a little bit of molasses and some common garden fertilizers, and you multiply the bacteria, the yeast, and the nematodes. And you create a tea that you can pour all over your garden. And 1 cup or 2 cups of worm castings goes a long way. You get to, like, you know, spread it out a lot more. And my one fun anecdote was when I was living out in LA, this guy I was living in Hollywood, in the Hollywood Farmers Market, he goes and takes out a little Gatorade bottle with like a tiny bit of dirty water in it. And he goes, all right, you know, like, we've been friends for a while. Here you go. I'm going to hand you this. I was like, worm tea? And he's like, oh, no, this isn't just worm tea. This is made in a special lab with special bacteria. So people take it very seriously. Commercial farmers definitely use the compost tea to great effect. You can do it, you know, it not only nourishes the soil and helps break down the NPK so that it's more bioavailable, but you're also, you know, you're also able to spray it as a foliar feed to all of your plants. And that foliar feed is absorbed through the leaves and also creates a protective barrier that makes the plants just healthier in general. And that's my spiel.
Wonderful. Ellen?
Okay. Well, my name is Ellen Schweiger, and like Tanya said, I work at Hancock High School. I've been there for 22 years, but we've had a garden, I think, for about the last 10. Gateway Greening has sponsored us. Now we do have a bin that we just use. We have our kitchen cafeteria. They supply some of our compost, and even our home ec teacher, when they're done cooking, they'll put stuff in there also. And So that's how we were introduced to compost. But then I can't remember who it was who brought up the vermicomposting. I got interested in doing some aquaponics in my class, and then I thought, well, we need to do some vermicomposting, just kind of dig in a little more into ecology, and just kind of show my students that there's more ways that you can be involved with composting. So along with our aquaponics, we were doing some vermicomposting. I did borrow a larger vermicomposter from Gateway Greening. And Tanya has some pictures that I had sent to her. If anybody was curious to see kind of what
Y'all see that?
Hopefully, yeah, this was what you can see. And I know she had mentioned, I don't know if you want to go back to the resources, you had mentioned the Worms Eat My Garbage. That's the book that you'd mentioned earlier. There's also another cute book called There's a Hair in My Dirt by Gary Larson. And it's not really, it's kind of a children's book, but actually it goes through a lot of ecology and decomposition. There's a worm who finds a hair in his dirt. And so there's a lot of ecology in that book if you're interested in talking with your kids about kind of like the ecology of composting and decomposition. So also, those are just some resources I thought somebody might be interested in. Oh, and I guess, there you go. Where I got my worms, I thought maybe somebody would like to know, where do I get worms if I'm interested in vermicomposting? Actually, I think it was Gateway Greening who pointed me to this person. It's called Mid-America Compost. Josh Benson, actually, he's local. He lives right here in St. Louis. Very easy to talk to. He just loves his worms. If you give him a call, or you can look him up on Facebook, he would love to help you if you're setting up, if you have lots of questions, he would love to talk to you. But he supplied our worms for our school bins, our worm bins for school. And I need to call him if I have a question for him. But like I said, he's a great resource for you if you're interested. So the bins that we got from Gateway Greening kind of look like this. So they're just big and boxy. And this is the inside of the green one. It's really good to have a layer of paper on top, keeps them moist. The worms breathe through their skin, so they need to stay moist. And if you peel that back, it's just kind of I use the shredded paper, just like Carlos said. I'm at a school, so we have lots of shredded paper. So you do make your bedding for the worms out of shredded paper. You can use cardboard. They even like a little bit of peat moss in there for a little bit of grit. And then you can start adding in your veggies. And this is the black one. You can see that the bedding is actually eaten up a lot faster than the other one. This is probably ready for some new bedding, because a lot of it you can see has already turned brown, and you can see a lot of the worm casting. Also, you can see I have a little cup down there at the bottom. Carlos had talked about worm tea. I actually use my worm tea. I'll just take that cup and I will put about half of it into a gallon jug and then fill it up with water. And then I will give that to my plants. I'll just pour it right into the dirt and with the plants. And then I'll do it again with the other half. I'll put it in my gallon jug, fill it up with water, and then share that with the other plants. So I do it very simply. I don't add anything to it except for some water. Is there anything else? Any other pictures there? Is that it? Oh, the classroom set. Sorry. Yeah. So those are the big bins. And the big bins were nice. They can kind of see, the students could see how the worms would break down the food. We use that kind of get started. But then I wanted to give them a chance to do their own inquiry and set up their own experiments. And I kind of brainstormed a little bit, but exactly what Carlos said, you really just need 2 bins. And it needs to be dark. Think about worms, are in the ground. They do not like light. So they like it dark. And in the next picture, I kind of show you how it's separated. That there's the bottom, for the bottom shoebox, I just sanded the outside and spray painted the outside black. And then drilled holes in the bottom of the top container. And the last picture just shows where the holes were. I honestly, right before COVID, we actually we were able to experiment with this. And you can see the holes. I drilled holes in the top of the top container. Honestly, when I do this again this year, I believe I will be making the holes a little bit bigger. I think those were too small. So you do learn from your experiences. We'll probably put more holes and make those bigger, just because the water did drain out into the bottom, but I don't think it drained out fast enough. And also with the two containers sitting inside each other, it probably didn't allow for there to be a lot of air exchange. So I might put like a little block of wood or something on the bottom or in between them, just to hold the two containers apart for a little bit, so that there's a little bit more air exchange, and air can get in there a little easier. So that's my homemade version. And I think in each shoebox, we probably did about maybe 100 worms in each shoebox. And the kids got to choose what they were going to experiment with. Some of the kids said, well, we're just going to put apples in ours. And some other groups said, we'll put bananas. And I think another group, they just tried different types of food, and we just monitored them. They were allowed to water them and turn their bins. And then they just kind of monitored to see which type of food did the worms like the best, which one decayed the fastest, did they eat up the fastest. And I think apples won in our case. But I mean, it was interesting to see. Some kids were, didn't want to touch them. They used pencils and they used, things to move the worms around, and other kids just dug right in and they loved them. This last year, we didn't get a chance to do the vermicomposting because of COVID. But I had this one girl who just loved them. Every day she'd walk in, she'd, can I spray the worms? And I mean, she was their caretaker. She sprayed them. She checked them out every day. So some students really got into it, and some walked right by it. But it was I think a great experience for them, just to see that it is possible, that you can compost your own materials. It never stank. We never had a smell. We had, when we did them in the shoebox, we did get some little critters, little teeny tiny, they weren't ants. I'm not exactly sure what they were, but when I talked with Josh one day, he said, it's okay. That's just nature. He said, they're just there to help decompose the organic material. And he said, you should probably see them disappear in a little while. And they sure did. So
Great.
that was good to hear.
Well, thank you. I want to just let the panelists know, I know you might see some questions coming in the chat or Q&A, but please don't, you have to respond to them, because even if you do respond to them, I'm going to go back to them because I want to make sure all the attendees can hear your responses. So don't even worry about the chat and the Q&A, and I'll go get to those. And if you see one, you want to drop an answer, but I'm going to read through those anyway. So feel free now to start dropping questions in the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to go back to some that I saw so that way the panelists can answer those for everyone to hear. I can find them now. So I saw Cynthia asked, what are the advantages of worms? So when we talk about composting, there's passive composting, which is really kind of like set it and leave it alone, where you're just kind of creating a pile and letting it do its thing, because decomposition is going to happen naturally no matter what. So you don't have to be an expert to break your scraps down. So there is like a passive way of doing it, but then there's also active composting, which when you're really a composter, that's kind of more what you're doing. You're composting in a way to really provide what those microorganisms want so that they are going to break stuff down quicker. And there's also the vermicomposting, which is worm composting. So just to make that clear for anyone that's completely new to this. So Cynthia asked, what are the advantages of using worms rather than just kind of having like this picture you see behind me, a bin or a tumbler? Carlos, do you want to, so you can answer that in the chat. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then anyone else can share their experience.
Sure. Yeah. Most of this is right off the internet. So, don't hold me to it too much. I don't have like a degree in vermicomposting or anything, or even like gardening or whatever. But from what I've read, the NPK, the nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and then all of the other micronutrients that plants need. You hear of iron deficiency and turning your leaves in one color or another. A lot of those things are not going to be bioavailable to the roots of the plant as such. So you can't just, expect the nitrogen to immediately become the nitrogen that the plants need. It has to mix with some of the other molecules down in the soil. And what makes that breakdown happen to like N plus Mg or whatever it might be are the microorganisms. So the fungi and the bacteria and the nematodes in the soil. And in order for that to happen in a more expedient manner, you can just have very healthy soil if you're lucky, or you can add things to your soil to make them healthier. So you can buy soil that has microorganisms already in it. You look at the soil, the fine print on the good stuff, and it's got microorganisms down there. And that's the whole point of it, is so that the plants can take that up. And that breakdown that happens because of those microorganisms. So what you're doing, whether you're just adding castings to your soil or taking, the diluted leachate, or going, the extra step of aerating it, that the reason for aerating it is because once you aerate it, that oxygen, all these things are they're aerobic bacteria, the kind that you want. The anaerobic bacteria are the ones that smell bad. And as soon as your tea or whatever smells bad, it's a good sign that you're going in the wrong direction. And so for all of the good ones, you want to just multiply it. And the more the fertilizer that you're paying good money for and taking all this time to dump out in your garden, whether, however you're choosing liquid or solid fertilizers, those are going to become, you're going to get more bang for your buck, basically, by adding microorganisms.
When your plant grows, it's using up like you mentioned, the NPK out of the soil, and it's using that. So when you put that compost tea into your soil, you're actually adding back in some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to the soil, so the plant has more of it.
And furthermore, when you put water into a living organism, it doesn't drain right through, it gets processed. And so the worm manure and the bacteria and the mycorrhizae in that actually hold on to water more when they're in the soil. And so that's another way of conserving water as well.
I know also with the outdoor composting, the bins, they talk a lot about having a good ratio of brown material to green material. And it seems like vermicomposting is good if you tend to have a lot more like green material or food scraps. I don't know if y'all would agree with that. I mean, that's really what it's used for, right? You have the paper, I guess, is the brown in there, but it's mainly good for food scraps. So
right, yeah, that's what I say. Your brown is going to be your papers. You can put napkins in there, your paper towels, even. You can also put that in with your bedding and as well.
And I guess, go ahead.
I was going to say I've used brown paper bags, and I actually use them, sort of soak them, and then use them as the cover for them. And I lift that up and put stuff in there. But they will go eat through the paper bags, newspapers, and things like that. And that, I do think, acts as the brown with the green wet stuff, but so that you can use it to decompose your paper too.
Yeah, and if anyone's has no idea what we're talking about with the brown to green, a lot of people talk about different. Oh, did you want
brown to green is really a nitrogen carbon ratio, or nitrogen compounds versus carbohydrate compounds in the browns.
And what we mean by browns, so that could be, those are examples, and kind of think about your brown material. So it could be like dry dead leaves, twigs, like I said, cardboard, or a straw, wood chips, things like that. And then greens are more like kind of fresh, like recently. Dead things like vegetables, fruits that we're pretty fresh, still kind of have that moisture. So grass clippings, things like that.
Gateway Greening does also have a great video on the composting and what browns and greens are and what to put in it and what not to put in it. I show my students that every year.
No, we had that. I'll have to revisit.
Yeah, it's a great video.
Okay. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, anytime.
So I see we have another question from Rachel. She said, my tumbler compost seems wetter and a bit smelly when compared to my bin. I filled in it with the same things. Do you know why this is?
I would venture a guess that the tumbler's not getting aerated enough. And as Carlos said, if it gets smelly, it's an indication it's doing more anaerobic. So even though you're tumbling it, you know, maybe it's too hot, it's in the sun, things are dying in there. And also it's not getting aerated enough, not getting turned enough, and possibly, you know, just, yeah, too much food waste. And I found that the tumbler is prone to that. At least in my experience, we had it get smelly a bunch of times. And that's why we ended up going to the 3-bin system, just easier to turn it into the next bin and just keep it moving like that. So,
can you tell us a little bit about the 3-bin system?
Yeah, so in a 3-bin system, which I'll plug Gateway Greening, they made for our school garden, you throw the new stuff into the bin all the way on the left. And you have 3 bins that are, you know, 2.5, 3 feet by 3 feet, something like that. And so as you throw stuff into the first bin, that's the wet, nasty stuff. And then as you turn that and it gets a little more digested, you toss it into the second bin, and then you add new stuff into the first bin, and the second bin ages for a little bit. And as you turn that, then you toss it into the third bin, and in the third bin, it's kind of ready for you to harvest it and use it in the garden. So makes it easier to keep track of new and versus old stuff.
I think one thing that's important to keep in mind, no matter what kind of composting that you're doing, is that at the end of the day, you're just trying to mimic nature. If you think of like a very lush rainforest, or you know, there was a question about what are the best kinds of worms to use. The ones that you mostly find online through sites or through the local guy, they're going to be what are called African red wrigglers, and that's different from like your earthworms, which are bigger. These ones are smaller, and the earthworms would actually eat these guys for breakfast. And the reason these ones are specialized is because they live in that top layer of naturally composting material. So when you have like leaves falling and fruit falling from trees, they're going to settle on the top, and that's what's going to break down. And so if you have something that's smelly, again, it goes back to this ratio of what are the things that are making up your compost pile. And if it is getting, you know, a little stinky, it's probably because it's hard to find, you know, if it's not the fall, where are you going to find finely shredded brown stuff? You're going to get some twigs in there, but the twigs are going to take much longer to break down than any kind of food scraps that you're putting in. So that's going to cause an imbalance in the ratio. So if you don't want to go and get yourself a worm bin, you could always just throw some shredded, like I also use the pre-moistened paper bags, because you don't want to throw anything that's too dry, because then that's also going to offset the balance of the moisture content. And yeah, at the end of the day, you're just trying to mimic nature. So if there's something that seems unnatural, just trying to think like, what would Mother Nature do in a natural environment?
Great, thank you. So I see another question from Kai. I've attempted composting without worms a couple times and haven't been able to get it quite right. What ratio of carbon browns to nitrogen-rich greens do you recommend, and how often should I turn my compost? So we kind of just touched on this, but so I guess that's specifically with worm composting, it looks like.
Well, she was saying, or the person was saying composting without worms.
Oh, without, you're right, yes.
Yeah, and 1-to-1 is a good place to start. But, you know, I've had compost working when it's 3 greens to 1 brown, and I've had it working when it's 3 browns to 1 green. It just slows down when you add too many browns, I think is kind of those tend to absorb more water, and it tends to slow it down, which might be what you want sometimes, so that you don't have as many pests or whatever. But definitely you have to, you know, 50-50 is probably the ratio that you should start looking at.
I know Gateway Greening, I think we usually recommend 1 brown to 2 greens, but like you said, a good place to start, and it kind of depends on, I guess, what your needs are too. I don't know if anyone else wants to touch on that.
I just wanted to add, and just what Carlos was saying, if you're doing an above ground composting, like during the summer, it's going to be really hot. And since if you don't have a lot of shade over your compost bin, it is good to make sure that you're keeping it slightly moist, because the microbes, that are in there are going to need some water. So if it dries out completely, you may be, suffocating any of those good microbes. So it's good to kind of give them a little shower with your garden hose, keep it moist. And one of those reasons is I'm a pretty lazy composter, and I really don't take a lot of time. I have just a real simple bin on the side of my house. It's not even a bin, it's a hole in the ground. So I dig a hole. I have a shovel sitting there. I dig a hole and I will dump my kitchen compost in the ground and then cover it back up. And I just let the earthworms there that are under the ground take care of things for me, because I'm just a pretty lazy composter. So I just dig a hole and put it. I think one time I got a little stinky. It's when I had a lot of like watermelon rinds, cantaloupe rinds. There's just a lot of rinds, and it got really moist. And the next time I went out, I noticed a little smell, and it was just from, you could smell it was the melons. And just a couple of days later, it dried out a little bit and the smell was gone.
Yeah, that's a great example of passive composting, but it works, right? It didn't just dig in a hole, then you don't just have the scraps piling up in your yard.
And when I do need some soil, I know where I can go. I can go to that little 2 foot by 2 foot mud pile, and I can take out my compost there, which also provided me couple of extra cantaloupes this summer in my garden. Seeds popped up. Whoops, a couple extra seeds got in there.
Yeah, I was gonna say I drag old logs out of the woods and get all the browns and everything, and I throw compost in the middle and then bury it again and just let it do its thing.
I'm pretty sure someone on YouTube has a fancy name for it. I've seen some videos.
Google
It seems to
culture.
work well for people.
Yeah, it's there's so many ways. You're just doing what nature does.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
Yep. And then you can plant it, which is, the
Right.
end game.
So please keep dropping any questions that come up in the Q&A or the chat. So another question we had is so I think this was mentioned briefly earlier, but a lot of people worry about getting gnats or fruit flies in their house if they're doing the vermicomposting indoors. Do you all have any recommendations for that? To cut back on any kind of bugs that might linger?
I do make sure I bury it underneath the bedding. If it's up on top, the fruit flies, if they can get to it, they'll find a way to it. But if it's buried, they have a much harder time getting to it. That would be my suggestion.
So I know one thing that we've found kind of works is if you zap the food in the microwave for like 20 seconds, sometimes it helps to cut down on that. And we've really never had any problems with it. Occasionally I'll have a couple of those fruit flies, but also just having a lid to put on top of Vermicomposter will help. But other than like a few little gnats, I haven't ever had that issue. Carlos has something to show.
What I have sitting in my kitchen almost at all times. And there was one little fruit fly that came here with it, but just one. I think it's a fine price to pay for keeping things healthy. The nice thing is all this stuff is not in your garbage bin where it would be stinking and rotting with all the other stuff that, like the meat and the vegetables are what make things rot. Just the pure vegetables. I even, I got some sourdough in there, and like the coffee grounds or like tea bags, you can just throw those right in there. And I'll occasionally, let me see if I can zoom in on some mold for all of you guys. I've Googled this like a million times because I'm like, scared of mold, but it's really not that bad. Like the mold that grows on coffee grounds is actually proven to be okay. And here I am pretty healthy. So, and then when it gets full, I dump this down into a bucket in my basement where my worm bin is. So it's nice and dark and cool, and in the winter it survives just fine. And you don't want to overfeed things, and you only really want to add fresh food when there's fresh bedding. And that's a whole process. So when I'm ready to go down there and spend an hour shredding some paper or some paper bags, then, I'll take that whole bucket and just layer a little bit of wet paper, a little bit of food, a little bit of wet paper, a little bit of food. That way you have a nice little layer cake of stuff going, and then the worms just migrate right into the fresh stuff because they want some fresh food. So no fruit flies. I have had in the past more fruit flies, but that is just when I've actually not been as careful about what goes into it. And you have to just avoid anything that is fat or meat products whatsoever. So if it's, like a sauce that you've cooked, don't put that in there. Anything that's going to ferment is going to attract fruit flies. That's the number one thing. The other question was for snails. So it's a similar thing. Like I just Googled it. I was like, I've seen snails before. I don't have them now. They apparently come from leaves. If you add leaves from the garden, it'll have the snail like larva in there, and then those will multiply. But they're usually not really bad. They don't eat. There's very few that eat your worms. And apparently, in order to get rid of them, you put beer, like a glass of beer, and it's so effective that you'll actually attract snails from like other gardens. Apparently, so I don't know. Insert Homer Simpson joke, but about the snails being sluggish. But
With
yeah.
with the
No
beer,
fermentation is what attracts everything else, and just avoid fermentation, like the rinds that were mentioned.
so when you mentioned the beer, because we actually, the vermicomposting bin I have right now that I'm teaching with is full of those snails. And I don't know how they got in there because we don't add outdoor scraps. Maybe at one point that happened. But when you say to put beer, are you just putting like an open can in there and it's attracting them? Or what are you doing with it?
I would say it has to have somewhere for the snails to crawl in.
Okay.
So you would probably put the beer in a cup, bury it down a little bit so that the snails can actually get in and fall in, and then some kind of something so that they can go in, but other stuff isn't going to go in. So maybe, I don't know, you'd have to. The nice thing about all this is it's you get to be creative with how you build things. I've never bought, like I did. No, I was gifted my worm bin, but it's one of those black ones that you saw earlier. But the bubbler, all the different aerators, I've just made those with drill, a little drill, some PVC pipe, and you just have to be creative. It's part of the fun.
Yeah, it could be a great engineering project for students too. So I see, let's see. Well, Susan had mentioned that she freezes her food scraps and then take them out once a week whenever it's full. That's great. Cynthia said, I'm a beginner and looking for an easy first step. I just bought a kitchen composter at Aldi. Now I want a bin to place outdoors to dump my kitchen compost. Where can I buy a ready-made bin, which can be turned over? I like the picture of the wood trays behind you. So I'll start just by saying the 3-bin system that you see behind Katya. I don't know if that was the one Gateway Greening made, but
Yes.
we actually have those. If you're a builder, we have those blueprints on our website, and I will definitely drop those in the chat section. So if you want to try to make your own 3-bin compost system, you can find everything you need for that. But I'll let you all answer that further if you have any suggestions.
Well, so this is really fancy, and like I said, we were doing 4,000 to 8,000 pounds of food waste in a school year. This got way nasty when we had too much food in there, and we just ended up putting a lot of browns in there trying to get it to even out. But this is probably perfect for a lot if you're composting a lot and you have a large family or a large garden. But much easier system might just be putting together a wire, like get some of that chicken wire or something even a little more sturdy, and just make a round circular thing that you can throw your compost in. And you can even turn it upside down, just take the whole thing and roll it on the ground and turn it upside down. It's got lots of aeration going on there. So that's pretty simple. And then I actually started out with the school garden, and I do not know if I have those pictures, but we had no outside compost. So I stacked straw bales too high, and made a square to put our compost in. And then as it got gnarly, we'd break up the straw and mix it in there. But, it was a no-brainer, and I guess composting creates creativity as well. So so I started out with that, with straw as the sides, and we'd have to go in there and chain, dig it up and whatever. But, and eventually we just had too much food waste to do it that way. But most home gardens do not produce, 4,000 to 8,000 pounds in a year. So, yeah. So you can start, just throw it on the ground under a tree and it'll start.
Very basic. That's all you need. What about though with pests? Do any of you find, sometimes we have schools who want to try composting, but they're worried about it attracting like rats and things like that. Any ideas of that? I know we have never seen that be the case. I usually wouldn't recommend putting outdoor compost space right outside your door. It's just for the sake of anything. It may attract bugs and smells potentially, but has anyone ever had any experience with other like larger pests being attracted the outdoor system?
Well, yeah. I mean, I lived in the city of St. Louis for a long time, and I had a compost the whole time I was there outside. And I used a variety of different methods. And one of them was just the pile under a tree, which the raccoons go through and the opossums go through and stuff like that. If it's not too bad, I just let them eat because they'll break things down also. But they can be a nuisance and a problem. And so then you have they used to have them at like Home Depot, those big plastic black things. The top opens up and you dump the compost in there, and it's got a little aerating thing underneath. That'll keep a lot of animals out. And obviously anything with chicken wire that's pretty tall will keep the animals out. So it's up to you where you live and how pesty the pests are. If you're getting skunks going after your stuff, then you want to stop them. But, if I see just a few raccoons or something in there occasionally, it doesn't bother me, mice or something. But you keep the compost away from the house so they don't go in your house. Put it in the back. So
the compost that I dig in the ground, I think at one point I did see a possum, around, and we also have a dog, and she is very curious about it too. I took an old milk crate, and after I had covered it up with dirt, I just set a milk crate on top of it with some bricks in it, and she leaves it alone. Our dog leaves it alone now, but she can't dig it up. So I just did a simple milk crate on top of it. It doesn't cover the whole thing, but it just deters her from any digging.
Right. And just to go back to from the previous questions, Lois had commented that her daughter gave her a stainless steel bucket with a round charcoal filter for the top, and that cut down on the odors. So that's something to try too if you're doing the indoor.
This was just like a hunch of mine while I was hearing this, and I just quickly Googled. They tend to feed on meat and like eggs. They will also eat fruits. So I think if you're very careful about not adding, eggshells are useless in compost as far as I've been able to tell. Like they never break down, they stay eggshells, the calcium, right? But no, not really, because it's not going to break down in time. You're going to take your compost, you're going to dump it in your garden, there's going to be eggshells everywhere. And so I've just even stopped adding that. And I think that as long as it doesn't smell a lot, because you're not adding things that smell to begin with, like things that ferment or meat, you're going to more easily avoid attracting pests. If they can't smell it, they're not going to go to it.
I was also just thinking, if you were, you kind of mentioned also schools. What's really important in a bigger environment, it's very important that the students are educated as to what goes in and what stays out. And we haven't started any type of a whole school program, composting program, and it's probably more for that reason, is that we would need to do a lot of educating in our cafeteria, and I'm sure, Kathy, you probably guys had to do a lot of educating of your students as to what can and cannot be composted, and that would have to be monitored at lunch times. And we didn't have anybody to do the monitoring, so we never did start that type of system. But that is very important, that when you're doing a big system like that with a lot of young children, that they understand, they get that education. I have had my classes make posters. We had wanted to start something like that, so we started with making posters, educational posters that we could put up so people would know what could and could not go in the bins.
Great. So I see a question, I know Ellen brought up earlier that she had some vegetable sprout from her compost, but Kai asked said that they find bell pepper seeds sometimes in the food scraps, and they're always sprouting. Is it okay for seeds to go into compost, or will the sprouts take away nutrients from the soil they're trying to create. And I know, whenever we have volunteers at schools, I always tell them, one thing you just don't throw in compost are weeds if they have gone to seed. You definitely don't want weeds growing in the compost. But that's an interesting question as far as, well, the sprouts take away from the nutrients as it's growing. So what are your thoughts on that? Seeds that maybe aren't weeds.
I would say that, just let it be. And sometimes I take the volunteers from my compost and transplant them someplace else. But, if you turn that over, those things die almost immediately, and it just adds more biomass. And so it's not really taking away any nutrients from the compost, ultimately, if you keep turning it and reintegrating those seedlings as compost.
I agree with you, Katya. Some of those cantaloupe that grew up in my home garden got dug up, and I just put them in little like sour cream containers, and I took them to our school garden. Yeah. So, but then also there's a lot of cantaloupe that sprouted up next to my tomatoes, and I just let them go. But however, if you have a small garden and that is not what you want in that space, just like Kathy said, you can, it will grow, and you have to be very careful about what it's growing next to. If it's something that's going to grow tall and block the sun from, the actual plant that you want, you may want to go ahead and take it out, or like Kathy said, you can take it out and you can put it back in your compost bin, and those nutrients will get recycled. You can also, if you're afraid of taking it out and disturbing your new seedlings that you had just planted, you could take a little pair of scissors and snip it off right at the ground, and it will stop it from growing. But if you really don't mind it being there, you can just let it grow and enjoy the produce from it. But otherwise, it really, I think, truly is up to you. But yes, you're all right. It will take the nutrients out of the soil, just like the other plants around it. So it's just up to you. If it's a nuisance to you, take it out, recompost it, dig it up, or move it.
You can always get a nice surprise. Volunteers, as Katya mentioned. I sprouted a bunch of chili peppers indoors this year for the first time because I wanted some more exotic varieties, and I got a lot of tomatoes out of it as well. So yeah, it's just like any other weed. Like, don't add weed seeds, as Tanya mentioned, but if you get seeds and you don't want them,
All fair game in composting.
Tomatoes are great about that too, huh? They're great volunteers.
but I got some tomatillos, which was, unexpected and awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
That's nice. Yeah.
So we only have about 10 more minutes. So if you have any last questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A. I did post the instructions for a 3-bin compost system if you want to try that out. Go ahead, Ellen.
I have a little question if we have a little time. So my question, I was going to call Josh, the worm guy, and ask him. So I actually usually keep my worm bins inside, but because of COVID, and I had to bring them both home. I really didn't have room in my house. So I put them outside. Now I have a lot of little ants in my compost, my Vermicompost. I was wondering if either one of you might have a suggestion. I do need to take one of those boxes back to school, and any suggestions on how to get rid of the ants in the Vermicomposter bin before I bring it back in?
And soap on each of the legs.
Oh, okay.
Nice work.
Perfect. So what kind of container is that? Is it just
This is a takeout container, but like a yogurt container. I mean, depends on the size of the bin.
Gotcha.
Do the trick. Just a little bit of dish soap.
So just putting that around the base of it so they're not crawling up to it.
Yeah, I've had that exact problem before.
Thank you, Carla.
Good to know.
Thank you so much.
And I actually was recently looking at a vermicomposting bin inside of a raised bed garden. And so you picture a big circle, like, maybe 5 feet across. And in the inside, you have either a small chicken wire thing, or you can do a little plastic tube and drill holes into it and sink that into the middle of the raised bed. and then you get a cover for it. And basically, you know, you put a little bit of bedding in there, a little bit of dirt, and then you just, and your red wigglers, and they can actually make it through much colder temperatures, insulated by the big garden bed that it's built into. And it's a way of doing vermicomposting outside.
That's
So,
cool.
yeah.
That's some of your kind of aquaponics experience coming through there. You're like hybridizing the environment.
yeah. So it's, you know, the older I get, and I'm pretty old now, the more I see that innovation happens with all of these composting ideas. And it's natural and quick fixes like Carlos had for the ant problem. It's not like, okay, now you have to spray Roundup on the, the things. There's lots of ways to do it. And it's great for kids to experiment with, and for, you know, people like me who might get bored in my retirement. But I just love, like, we all have these different experiences and ideas, and then the people that are our participants have been bringing things up, and, you know, new different ways of doing things. So it should encourage us, all of us, to continue experimenting with composting. And you're probably not doing anything wrong. You can Google it, like Carlos said, you know, smelly fruit flies, or whatever, and you can find some answers. So I just want to encourage everybody to try one method or another at home, because you know, one of the reasons we're doing this, not just for plant health, but when you take food waste to a landfill, we generate methane. We generate tons and tons of methane, which are methane's actually 25 times worse for absorbing heat and keeping it in our atmosphere than CO2 is. And our landfills, I think, are about between 15 and 20% of the methane load that we put into our atmosphere. And if we can reduce food waste in our landfills, we essentially will bring down that methane a whole lot. And so, you know, that's one of the important reasons to persevere with this stuff, experiment with it, and figure out ways of keeping your food waste out of the landfill, essentially.
What a great note to end on, too. But if anyone does have any other last questions, we just have a few minutes. Please drop those quickly. I saw Cynthia asked if you all could get a copy of the notes. I'm assuming that's just from the chat. And I do think there is a way for me to download that with Zoom whenever I save it. So I can definitely email that out to attendees, so you have these sites. You might want to jot them down just in case, but I think that is an option. I also just dropped in there a website I came across a while back. It's called sharewaste.com, and it's kind of a map. So if you have scraps that you want to compost, but you don't want to do it yourself, you can locate folks on there who will collect your scraps. But you can also, if you want more scraps to compost yourself, you can be a drop-off point for that. So just kind of a fun map to look at if you want to check that out. And I see Carlos dropped a Compost Tea science site on there.
Yeah, I really want to encourage anybody, no matter what kind of composting you're doing, it's really fun to try your hand at some Compost Tea, and it goes a really a long way to making a healthy garden. And you know, you might not have that much compost, and you're like, okay, which of my plants is special and gets the compost? Well, you don't have to decide that anymore. They're all equally special when you have enough tea to go around for everybody. So it's really it's a lot easier than that site will make it out to seem. You can always like look up other recipes that people have like just distilled down, and it's really just molasses, fish emulsion, and some seaweed, and that's it. That's all you need. And then the other stuff, the rock phosphate, is an extra, but it's really quite useful. All you need is a 5-gallon bucket, an aquarium pump with some stones, and that's it. And you know, if anybody wants to connect, I'm Short Poet online, shortpoet.com, and it's my Instagram as well. We can talk about gardening and share additional knowledge. I saw somebody drop that sharewaste.com. That's really cool. I'm going to check that out, because sometimes you don't have enough scraps. Sometimes you have too much.
Exactly. Great. Well, I think we'll go ahead and stop there. Again, to all of our attendees, this will be it should be on YouTube by the end of the day tomorrow, most likely, and I will do my best to email out a copy of the chat to everyone if I can find that. Thank you so much, Carlos, Katya, and Ellen. I think this was great, and I know I learned a lot from it. So I see Carlos dropped his info if you want to continue connecting with him, and you can always reach out to Gateway Greening with questions too. So thank you everyone so much for attending, and happy composting.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, Tanya, for setting everything up.
Have a good night. Bye.